Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, whackers, crackers and life hackers, welcome along to the Joe Spivey YouTube channel where we discuss books and little else. You join me on a typically overcast Friday in northern England. It is, as I say, terribly dull, and I've been out for my morning walk this morning and have seen a man not so much walking a dog as walking a basilisk by lead. It was dragging him across the road rather than vice versa. And as per usual, he thought it was profoundly weird of me not to want to have that basilisk slash dog jump up at me and lick my face off and get all of its frankly gooey saliva all over me. And so when I withdrew to the other side of the road, he looked at me rather like a fool. But there we are. It's a small little anecdote from my morning, but you join me for our second little foray into Victober, ladies and gentlemen. If you've been living under a literary rock for the last few weeks and months and perhaps even years, I shall explain that Victober is an event organised by some of the more prominent YouTube booktubers on here, in which they advocate and encourage us to read more Victorian literature, more Victorian poetry, heaven forbid Victorian non-fiction. And I ended my last video on Wuthering Heights by telling you all that I would be reading Mr. Dickens this week. And here we have it. This is David Copperfield. Contrary to our book last week by Emily Bronte, Charles Dickens is a man who couldn't stop typing. He is perhaps the man best known for transcending our weird anchorite, cave-dwelling little section of the world. He is known by every non-reader alive, and has wrote reams and reams and reams and reams and reams. He is shoved onto the desk. If for example, you are between the ages of, I don't know, 12 and 92, and you have received an education, then you will have him had him either. I can't see that book awfully well, can I? Let me just close that blind. You will have seen him. You will have had him slapped onto a desk, or slapped into your lap, or thrust onto a chalkboard, or any other such educational peremptory will have meant that he has been, as I say, placed before you. He is perhaps the most well-known writer in the world, now and forever. And I'm sorry to say I'm going to have to blaspheme, ladies and gents. I've never really gotten along with him. Is that light any better? Shall I turn the light slightly? Oh goodness. Let's have a look. Let me just try and mediate. I think that's a little bit better. This is David Copperfield for Victober that I've been reading. I am approximately 2/3 of the way through, and brief synopsis: this is a small boy who, for the first 6 or 7 years of his life, lives in relative bliss with a woman called Peggotty, who loves him dearly, and of course his mother. Never knows his father. He dies, I think, probably about 6 months prior to his birth. And it follows his vicissitudes as he traverses London, Yarmouth, Canterbury, all sorts of places of that ilk. And my problem with Charles Dickens, largely, is that he creates gargoyles. He is known and lauded academically and by just his seeming acolytes to have created the most distinct and, as E.M. Forster put it, round and not flat characters, and yet he creates, I believe, just such egregious examples of various different sentiments. So if there is a good person, they will be literally unbelievably good for the entire novel, or if he creates somebody who is cantankerous, they will be moody and cantankerous and nihilistic for the entire novel. And this is the case with many of the people in here. So after those 5 or 6 years of, as I say, relative bliss, he is whisked off to Yarmouth with Peggotty, whose family live on a boat there. And it eventually, well, it eventually comes to pass that he has basically just been whisked out of the way so that Mr. Murdstone can marry his widowed mother. And that brings me to another fault that I really despise of Dickens, which is that he lets their names do most of the work for his character building. He has acronyms for characters. So if somebody is, as I say, cantankerous or shouts a lot, they will be called Mr. Moody Loud or something like that. We have Mr. Murdstone, who, as his name might suggest, isn't a typically favourable character. And you have his sister who comes into the house and is horrible to him as well. And then he is moved along to Salem House in London, which is, again, another leitmotif of Dickens, is that he will thrust a young boy into a debilitatingly terrible and unhelpful and evil academy, such as a terrible school. It happens in Nicholas Nickleby, it happens in Great Expectations, I believe, it happens in most of his novels. You will have Oliver Twist. A young boy is essentially fended off left and right until he's about 21. And this happens twice. He goes to Salem House, where he meets Mr. which is under the tuition of Mr. Creakle, who is sadistic and horrid and has found that whipping boys and subjugating them affords him pleasure. Nicholas David Copperfield here meets Mr. his friend Steerforth, who we are soon left to feel dubious about. Steerforth is about 18 when David Copperfield is 8 or 9. So there's the obvious superiority there right from the beginning, and he essentially takes him under his wing and ensures that David doesn't have as hard a time as he would otherwise have had. Because the reason he's whipped off to Salem House is because he bites Mr. Murdstone, and then they have him wear some chalkboard which says, "Beware, this boy is a biter," or something of that description. His mother and just-born baby sister, I believe, are then killed off by Dickens in an inexplicable fashion, and that is brushed over in the space of half a page and gone and left. And then he is taken to a wine merchant's, where he stays over with Mr. Micawber, who is frankly allergic to money, terribly impecunious, but is rather comical in his flippancy and his not unerring, he's very erring, but his unending sort of keenness, his Panglossian infantile innocence, despite the fact that he is terrible and can do nothing and hasn't got two pennies to rub together, he's very keen as well. He then becomes a proctor, which is the Victorian version of a solicitor, but they don't quite have the moral standards that we would bequeath upon solicitors nowadays. So they will often defend people that are quite objectionable, and he finds this to be quite agreeable as well. And I'm up to the point now, what am I? I am about 2/3 of the way through. He is working for Mr. Spenlow as a proctor and is in love with his daughter, Dora, who is a work-shy girl of privilege that's just so very off-putting. I don't know what David's thinking. And that about covers it, really. This is the novel that Dickens loved most. It was his personal favourite, and in it we see most of Dickens. And again, with anything that's quasi-autobiographical, we are then led to believe that because it's such a close reflection of the author's life, we're meant somehow to love it. And we're meant to give it perhaps a little bit of a free pass if it doesn't explain itself, or if it isn't quite up to the quality of something they've previously written, or something written contemporaneously, for example, like a Trollope novel or an Eliot novel or a George Meredith novel or something like that. But I've got a few sections that I picked out just to give you a flavour. I hardly need to give you a flavour of what Dickens does because, as I said, his influence is so ubiquitous. His name casts such a long shadow, and he's the antecedent of so very much that we see today. But I've just got a few, as it were, sort of quintessential Dickensian sentences that I wanted to pick out. So you have, this is a gentleman called Mr. Barkis who Peggotty marries. Peggotty's essentially his a sort of born-in servant, sort of that David is left with. And again, Dickens is remarked for his comedic turns of phrase and his evocation of ridiculous circumstances. And so this is essentially his rendering of a miser's hoard. This is Mr. Barkis's hoard. And again, I shall read and maybe you'll enjoy it. In this coffer, his riches hid themselves with such a tenacious modesty that the smallest instalments could only be tempted out by artifice, so that Peggotty had to prepare a long and elaborate scheme, a very gunpowder plot for every Saturday's expenses, meaning that he's quite tight-fisted as well. Again, you can tell I'm not nearly as fluent as I have been on other videos because I don't know what to say about Dickens. He again, this is blasphemous, but he slightly bores me, and that doesn't come from me being some modish indigene of the digital age for whom it is impossible to delay gratification and can't focus on a piece of writing for more than 15 minutes, because that is not me. I read for hours and hours every day. I can suspend disbelief very easily if a writer draws me in, but I have not been able to do it with anything that Dickens has ever written, apart from A Tale of Two Cities, which I really enjoyed. But I've now read, I'm 2/3 of the way through this, Nicholas Nickleby, Christ Alive, Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, and then now, so I've read 5 of it. By the end of this week, I'll have read 5 of his novels, 80% of which I care not for, really. Amongst the YouTube cadre, he has lots and lots of fans, and I watched a video earlier. Benjamin McAvoy, who has tens of thousands of subscribers. I'm sure you'll have at least have seen one of his videos, and he dedicates an entire hour to Dickens on YouTube. And so he gives at the end of that video, in which he dissects every single book that he owns by Dickens, he has a few prompts and a few tips if you're yet to encounter his oeuvre and you want to get into the Dickensian universe. So his first tip is read Dickens with a long-term view, and he very cleverly complicates Dickens, or doesn't really complicates Dickens with Shakespeare here, in that you are supposed to view Dickens in his complete and utter totality, rather than admit that his books aren't self-fulfilling. And so he says that, as I said, that a Dickens novel should be read solely in respect to his other novels. And then the second bullet point is read into the heart of childhood, because he says, of course, there is nobody who evokes childhood quite like Charles Dickens. And that might be true, but again, it's never done it for me. Third, read without condescension on his sentimentality and hyperbole, which, again, I think is a clever little piece of jiu-jitsu, really. Read without condescension, as though to critique something that is a very obvious fault within a work is to condescend when it isn't. Those two things are mutually exclusive. You can criticise without condescending. Befriend the characters, which I've parenthesised next to it, we would if we could. And again, he conflates Dickens with Shakespeare. Nobody peoples their world quite as much as Charles Dickens ever did, which, of course, I suppose it's a matter of academic record, but again, he's never done it for me. Another bullet point, trust Dickens, i.e. he knows what he's doing, which is, I think, where the problem lies. So you've got to, if you have to caveat a certain text by saying, this is a long haul, it's going to be difficult, then surely that is an explanation that speaks for itself. Yeah, trust Dickens, he knows what he's doing, but I can't think of... There's a difference between meeting somebody halfway. So, for example, somebody's elusive poetry like John Donne, you have to meet him halfway because he was writing a couple of 100 years ago and is making references to various aspects of theology and philosophy about which most people, including myself, know very little. And so you have to meet him halfway. You have to be open to being confused with somebody like that. But with Shakespeare, he's only writing 150 years ago. And again, I think Benjamin McAvoy mixes up meeting somebody halfway and trusting somebody with being in complete deference to them. And then the final bullet point is read serially, which means just to read everything that he's ever written, which would make your eyes bleed, I think, frankly. So yes, this is it. This is Victober number 2. This is David Copperfield. I realise I haven't explained the twists and turns of it very much or very successfully, but that's because I can't get behind it. And if Dickens had much shorter novels that would take 2 or 3 days to plough through, then that would be fine. But almost everything that he has written is an absolute stomper, okay, that you could feed a small, impoverished family for 6 or 7 days with. They are huge. So you can see how very, very reluctant I am even to do a video about him. I will finish it, and I think next time delve into just why I believe it, or why it seems to me Dickens is very popular, because I think it's much more to do with his own self-manufacturing of celebrity rather than the fruitfulness of his prose and his writing. But yes, that's your Victober book for today. Again, I would like to say thank you all so very much for your helpful and complimentary comments. It's great that you are happy that I'm making videos, and I shall go on forever after. Hopefully my next Victober video, is going to be David Copperfield, but hopefully after that we can get on to something that I find a little more enticing. But yeah, thank you ever so much for watching. Thank you, BookTube.